three, go. Excellent timing. Thank you, Angie. My name is Rebecca Gutierrez Moreno, and I am the State Pollinator Coordinator with Environmental Quality Board. And I am joined here today by my colleague, Angela Kolinich, Angie for the Friends. And she is our interagency pollinator protection team member from the Department of Education and helping us facilitate this meeting and be kind of like in the background helping us with the logistics. We're also joined today by our guest speakers that I'm so thankful and happy that they could be part of this webinar. And I'm thankful for their time and that they put together that they're giving us for putting together these presentations. And their names are Karin Jokela from the Xerces Society, and I will say a little bit more about each one of them before their presentations. We're also joined by Sami Dolan from the University of Minnesota Bee Lab and Alexandra Zerzan from Metro Blooms. But before we start with the presentations, I want to talk a little bit about logistics. If you have questions during the presentations, please use the chat feature, not the Q&A feature. Angie and I will be monitoring the chat and we'll bring those questions to the presenters at the end of the three presentations. So we will have an assigned Q&A time for answering, and they will be answering your questions as we go along in that section. And also, so again, the webinar has been recorded so that we can have this recording available for all of you. And for those who registered but for some reason couldn't be here at this time, you can have them the presentation available on our pollinator webpage for the Environmental Quality Board pollinator webpage. And we will send a notification to all of those who registered once the presentations are posted. And without further ado, I think it's time for us to start with our first talk, which is why is fall a critical season for pollinators and other invertebrates? And our presenters, Karin Jokela from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Karin is a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society. She collaborates with Natural Resources Conservation Service staff in Minnesota and Wisconsin to provide individual consulting to farmers on habitat restoration and biodiversity conservation, and serves as an advisor to staff of other conservation organizations. Thank you so much, Karin, for being here. Please take over.
Okay, hopefully I kind of have already. You can see my screen.
Yes, we do.
And thanks, perfect. And I just want to say thank you all for being here. If you are feeling any of the fall vibes like I am, you probably don't want to be sitting in front of a computer. You'd probably rather just be out there in that sunlight. And I've tried my best to make this presentation a little bit of a photo essay that will make you feel like you're in the fall, even if you're sitting in front of a computer. Anyway, I'm gonna give a kind of a broad overview of kind of why fall is important for pollinators and other invertebrates and kind of tee up some of the content that the next speakers are gonna offer. But before I get into the content, let's see what's the most efficient way to advance. There we go. I do just want to say a couple of things about the organization that I work for, which is the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We're a nonprofit wildlife conservation organization that works to protect invertebrates and their habitats. We take our name from this little blue Xerces blue butterfly on the kind of upper right there. It's the first butterfly to go extinct due to human-influenced habitat loss in the United States. So we started as a butterfly conservation organization and have since kind of expanded our scope to include protecting all the things without a backbone. And we do this in a lot of program areas. A lot of us work with farmers. A lot of us work in urban kind of spaces or doing pesticide reduction. A lot of different programs. Let's see. And my executive director would want me to say that we are also a member-based organization. And so those of you who are in the audience and are already members, I'm here to say thank you so much for supporting the work that we do. I'm also here to make a little pitch that if you want to become a member, there are a lot of perks, one of which is that you can get a member prize or like a gift, right? And so you could pick out one of these signs as a member gift. And then even if you don't want to become a member, one of the things we're really known for is creating all of this technical guidance to help people achieve their restoration goals. I'm going to go back to that for just one second. All of this is available as downloadable PDFs on our website, and we also have a number of social media channels where you can find a lot of information to learn more. Okay, now moving on. We at the Xerces Society really believe that invertebrates are the heart of a healthy landscape, because invertebrates are really they're running the world. They're doing all the things, such as creating food for wildlife. They're turning their bodies into little protein packages for trophic kind of movement so it can feed birds, reptiles, and so forth. They are contributing to soil health, they're contributing to pest control, and of course, pollinating plants. And it's one thing to show all of these services in a really natural landscape, like I've shown here in the background. But these services are actually occurring all around us in our home habitat, the places where we live. And there's a lot of ways to recognize their value in our home, right? I took this slogan, "Home is where the habitat is," from the National Academy of Conservation Districts, where every year they do a poster contest for kids to kind of like illustrate what this saying means. And for me, what I'm always trying to emphasize is that like we belong in these habitats. We don't just create pollinator habitat over there for the bees, and then we live over here. Like this can be integrated. And so these things can be in our homes as well. Okay. So that's sort of like central tenets of Xerces' mission. And then I just wanted to address like we're here talking about fall. There's like this fall energy, at least I'm feeling it, where the daylight's changing. We have these really warm days, cooler nights, you slow down in the evening, and then there's this frenetic energy kind of in the afternoon. At least I really feel this sort of like inner squirrel where I'm like, just want to be outside, collecting all the seeds, collecting all the remaining sunlight so that I can prepare for the winter and have that nourishment to get me through the winter. And it's not just us. Invertebrates are responding to these environmental shifts and changes and cues as well. And so, yeah, I just wanted to like set the stage for what we're like the space that we're talking about here and how invertebrates are responding to all of this. And even though fall, you might say, is kind of characterized by change, we know that fall is actually changing. And I'm not a climate change expert, but and if you want to learn more about exactly how fall is predicted to change, I would suggest going to the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership kind of website where you can find maps of all this stuff. But we know that, we're going to have longer growing season. That means earlier spring thaw and later fall freezes. And that is going to have implications for pollinators. We're going to have longer, warmer, and possibly wetter falls and winters. It's unusual to have this warm spell longer and longer into the fall, and that has consequences for pollinators and invertebrates. And then that is also going to be punctuated by some extreme events where we have these warm days and then suddenly really cold days. And that has impacts on insects and the plants that they depend on and all the phenology. So just as a sort of, I have here climate change and how it affects pollinators, but you could also think about how this is affecting just invertebrates in general. There's like these buckets of ways that climate changes might be impacting invertebrates. One is that it's actually impacting their physiology, how those changing temperatures might be impacting survival or growth and just how they reproduce, the success of all of those different stages. In some parts of the world, this is really causing range shifts where insects are trying to move into refuge areas that are more comfortable for their body physiology. And so that's changing the way invertebrates behave in the environment. We're having these changed phenology, sort of mismatch of the way that maybe plants are responding to environmental cues in the way that insects are responding to them. So then they don't match up the way they used to. And then the climate change is actually just impacting the plants themselves, which has impacts on nutrition for the invertebrates or the pollinators that are using those plants. And then, of course, all of these effects are combining and interacting in unique and novel ways, and that's resulting in new interactions, new exposure to new microbes, new predators, diseases, and so forth. So fall is changing, and that impacts invertebrates. But we, as animals, organisms that live in those same environments, we can have a role in stewarding the habitat for real resiliency to those changes. So I just put out some central kind of tenets of what I would consider resilient habitat, and that is centering biodiversity, offering year-round support for all kinds of wildlife, providing refuge, creating environments that hold water, improving connectivity between habitats, and then reducing stressors that are going to amplify some of those stresses. Okay. I have more content than is responsible for the time I'm allotted here, so I'm rushing through. So I just want to, like, this is the photo essay part, right? Where I'm trying to show you what a resilient habitat can contain. For wildlife, it needs to have food and medicine. So for pollinators, we think of pollen and nectar, but there's a lot of pollinators that actually need the plant materials. Like on the far left here, I have a picture of a leafcutter bee that needs certain kinds of plant materials to line its nest cells. Some pollinators rely on different saps and resins for part of their life cycle. A lot of pollinators need a prey source to carry out part of their life cycle. And then later on, they become a pollinator visiting a flower. So they need food, they need shelter. Some of them just need a perch site away from wind, away from pesticides. And what I'm trying to help you visualize here is that there are all these nooks and crannies in environments that maybe don't always get appreciated as much as like plant flowers for pollinators. Actually, we need kind of these nooks and crannies so that these pollinators, the diversity of pollinators, can carry out their rich kind of life cycles. So strategies to create this fall habitat. I won't go into any more detail than this because Alexandra's going to do that later. But just make sure you're having a diversity of floral resources that are blooming in the fall to really boost up the energy reserves of those that need to overwinter and start a new colony or just another life stage in the spring. The rest of the presentation here, I'm going to kind of go through some of these strategies that we outline in our nesting and overwintering document here. So these are just some of them. Some I'm going to go into more detail than others. But you can find more of all of these strategies online by searching out this document. The first is that probably gets the most media attention because it has a catchy slogan, is leave the leaves. And there's a lot of good reasons for this, and I'm going to spend a little time on that. It's a really important place for pollinators to shelter and overwinter is underneath this leaf litter. A lot of people have questions about what they do with the leaves, if they're supposed to just leave it on the grass or what. And I'm just going to, point you to one resource that I think is really great, Homegrown National Park. These are just clips from their Instagram page with creative ways to use this leaf litter without destroying it and to protect the integrity of the habitat value. But ideally, you're not just leaving leaf litter on a lawn because that's not great resilient habitat. Ideally, you are doing something that's a little bit more akin to this concept of soft landings. And this is an idea, well, there's a bunch of contributors to this concept. But Heather Holm has a really great soft landing website that I've linked there on the bottom, where it's the emphasis is basically a lot of butterflies and moths will lay their eggs on these really high value trees like oaks, cherries, willows, birch. And the caterpillar will kind of feed on those leaves throughout the growing season And then in the fall, they'll drop to the ground and probably overwinter as a pupa or some other life stage in the leaf litter or in the shallow soil there. And the only way that they can kind of like follow through that whole life cycle is if we leave kind of a soft landing that's not disturbed below the drip line there. And we care about these partly because they feed a lot of birds. These caterpillars are little, like I said, little protein packages to feed birds and other wildlife. We also care about them for their own sake. Um, so now I'm just going to give you some images of what a soft landing can look like, right? A spring view, maybe a fall view, a small scale view. And these are the places where migrating birds are going to come through and take advantage of that burst of life that's coming in those habitats. And just more kind of ways to share this messaging. These are all available for redistribution for social media. And they explain some of our most precious charismatic invertebrates really require this leaf litter. And then some invertebrates like pollinators, some of them nest in stems. Like an example would be this small carpenter bee, a Serratina species. About 30% of them do this. So they'll carve out like little bedrooms where they provision nest cells for their babies, and then get through the winter that way. I'm going to describe this in a little more detail in a second here, where like how you could support this process, which is to create stem nesting habitat for multiple seasons. So the first part is where you have a dead stem or flower stalk in the winter. It might look like this. The next phase would be in the spring, where you kind of cut back those flower stems and create openings in those stems. The next season is summer, where basically the new growth kind of goes over those cut stems. You don't even see them anymore. In this picture, there are cut stems that are just hidden. The next season comes along, fall. Suddenly you have the flowers of this year's growth that you can leave over the winter. And somewhere buried in there are last year's cut stems that bees are starting to use and grow in. And then, the next spring, you can cut back again and you have multiple years of bees being able to inhabit those stems. And as a segue, I'm just going to say here that you do not need to buy habitat on Amazon. I'm going to show you here on the right a picture, like a series of pictures from a block that was given to me at a conservation event. And I just thought I would do a little time sequence to see what was happening with it. So I got this in June and I started to notice that bees were showing up and provisioning little cells in there. So those green circles are newly occupied cells. A few weeks later, a few more got occupied. So now we've got lots of cells occupied with probably little baby bees forming in there. By July 19th, many of those cells had been destroyed because presumably a woodpecker or some other bird had found all of those little holes and took advantage of that resource there. By July 27th, more had been destroyed, but a few were still there. By August, now this is just 2 months into it, more had been destroyed. A couple more got occupied again. And by August 24th, basically, we had very little still occupying that nest block. All this to say that this artificial habitat sometimes doesn't actually achieve our conservation goals because we're not protecting it with a bird net or anything like that. And instead, it just becomes a really high density resource for woodpeckers. So instead, we could be using natural nesting methods like saving snags, planting a log. This is a site from a farmer that I visited. You can kind of see he's got a prairie meadow kind of in the background of the big picture. And when I showed up at his farm, he had literally planted snags in this sort of garden of snags because he was tired of the birds hitting his windows. And but so instead he wanted the birds to perch on these snags and the woodpeckers to go after the bugs in those. And so he had all these different structures. He had so many bees in there. It was all spread out. He was trying to attract mice, to attract the bumblebees. He was trying to attract snakes. And he was having a lot of success. And I thought, even though this is high density and sort of pseudo artificial, it was very productive and supporting a lot of insects over the winter. Okay, I know that I don't want to eat into the valuable time of my co-presenter, so I'm going to move quickly, but just more imagery about protecting overwintering sites. Rocks, these can be small or large. A lot of our insects nest in the ground, so just not tilling up the ground. And when you're doing this, it's helpful to notify the neighbors about what you're trying to accomplish here. This is a landscape from my friend Leslie Pilgrim, where it looks a little unconventional perhaps, and she created a sign saying, "Shh, there's nesting insects. We left this way on purpose." Here are a few more signs to help tell the story of what you're trying to do. Um, then and other activities you can be doing in the fall to promote this resilient habitat is to just collect the seeds, save some, distribute some, make a plan for how you're going to grow habitat in the future. Learn and go through your old photos. This is part of the fall, like you're sitting down, you're getting cozy, you're reflecting on the season that you had. You might find these photos in your phone. For example, this image I have where I found this, what I thought at the time was a bumblebee. And then when I looked closer, I realized this is actually a robber fly mimicking a bumblebee, and it was eating a Japanese beetle. And I thought the world and science needs to know about this because this is natural pest control. It's so cool, the biology of this. And we need to share what we're observing in our habitats so that we can better conserve and make policy to support that kind of life. One last thing here, which is that fall is also a great time to go out and monitor and see what your habitat is doing in the fall. I decided to like take my own advice as I was building this presentation. And I just about an hour ago, there's this picture. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the upper middle part where there's like a columbine flower and a little circle here. Basically, I planted a cup outside in my front yard under the drip line of this beautiful oak tree I have, where it's just starting to leave some leaves. And every day, I am just going to go out and see what passive insects I have collected in this cup and discover kind of the life that's underneath the leaf litter. And I might not see everything. Many of these organisms go undetected. But this is a way that on our way out to the vehicle, I and my kids can go check our cup, empty it. It's passive. I'm not killing anything, right? I can just empty it out after we've observed what's there. We have a lot of tools to help educators and community members do this. So go explore some of those on our website. And then I will just say, just encourage us all to take the fall and winter to think about how we can tap into any one of these or multiple of these categories, because we have a lot to learn about how to conserve insects, but we also know a lot and we can do our part. Okay, I am super happy to hand this off to Sami because I can't wait to hear about some like profiles of invertebrates. I'm going
Thank you
to.
so much, Karin. Thank you so much for this talk. I love your passion and your enthusiasm. I really appreciate it. And yes, we're gonna move to our next talk, which is how do wild pollinators survive the winter? And our presenter is Sami Dolan from the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. Sami is an entomologist and educator who is currently working with the U of M Native Bee Lab. Her work focuses mainly on the nesting habits of Minnesota's native bees. And I'm very excited about this talk. Sami, take it over. We can see your presentation. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, great talk, Karen. I really wanted to just echo the point of you don't need to buy your habitat off of Amazon. I really like those ways that you presented ways that we can create habitat for pollinators. And I'm really happy that my co-presenters are talking about all these awesome ways that you can create habitat for pollinators because that gives me time to just talk about what pollinators are doing and some of the biology behind how they survive winter. Hence, my talk is titled, How Do Pollinators Survive Winter? So this is a picture that I took very recently when I was out in the field. This was up in Crowhasset Nature Reserve, just north of the cities. And this is kind of how I'm seeing fall right now in Minnesota. There's mixes of browns and greens and reds. And it's really beautiful. And we've had really beautiful weather. It's been really hot. But right now, a lot of these pollinators are kind of scrambling and preparing for winter. This may look like a familiar scene to us that live in Minnesota. Winter is really cold and it's hard and it's long. And so as fall transitions into winter, pollinators have to prepare. Um, we have cold temperatures in Minnesota from October, sometimes all the way to May. It's really hard. And so it makes me think about when I'm thinking about, and I was making this talk about pollinators, I was thinking like, how does a bee or a butterfly or a pollinating beetle or all other kinds of pollinators cope with such a long, cold winter? And the world of insects is really big. Insects are one of the most biodiverse group of organisms on the planet. And there is like millions of different ways that insects deal with changing climates and changing seasons. Um, and I don't have time to talk about them all. And I'm going to talk about just a couple here in Minnesota. One strategy that a lot of insects use in Minnesota is to stay in Minnesota and hibernate through the winter. This is a little picture of a bumblebee nestled into some leaves and pine needles as she's looking for a place to hibernate. So it's a lot of insects, are making that move to prepare for winter and stay here. Others leave Minnesota entirely. They don't even deal with winter at all, and they migrate to warmer temperatures. And one insect that might come to your mind when you think of migration is the monarch butterfly. So these are the two main strategies I'm going to be talking about in this presentation of how insects are dealing with winter. And as somebody who works in a native bee lab at the University of Minnesota, I'm going to be a little biased in this presentation. I'm going to talk a lot about how native bees survive the winter. In Minnesota, there's over 500 different kinds of bees, and all of them stay here and hibernate to survive the winter. But with all those bees, there's so many different strategies that these bees use, and timings and emergences and developmental periods and all kinds of different biology and natural history that these insects have to survive the winter. So I'm going to get into it and tell you a little bit about one of my favorite insects, the bumblebee and the group of bumblebees. In Minnesota, of those 500 species of bees, 25 of them are bumblebee species. So they make up a pretty small amount of the bees in Minnesota. However, bumblebees are very common and we see them a lot on the landscape. Especially right now, we're seeing a lot of bumblebees in the fall, a lot of queens this fall, getting ready for winter. Bumblebees are annual insects, which means that they take a full year to complete their life cycle. So right now in this stage of their life cycle, these queens in the fall have mated with a male, so they're ready to go on to the next year and start a new colony. But to do that, they need to survive the winter first. So right now they're spending so much of their time, all of their time, foraging for nectar and pollen on different plants. This is a picture that I love of a rusty patch bumblebee queen I saw in 2022 foraging on this awesome plant called field thistle. A thistle that I love and is a native plant of Minnesota and a really, really important plant for insects preparing for fall. You can see this bumblebee on it, but also all of these little beetles foraging on it as well. So as the bumblebees have fattened up and gained those fat reserves to be able to sustain themselves throughout the winter, these bumblebees need to find a place to overwinter and hibernate for those long months of winter. And we're still, as a bumblebee community, learning a lot about how bumblebees hibernate and where they like to choose habitat for overwintering. So there's not a lot known, but some things that I think are known are bumblebees need two things for sure. to overwinter. They need a place that's insulated. They need a place that's insulated from the really, really cold temperatures. And they need a place that is concealed so that they're safe from predators or some hungry vertebrate in the winter that is dying for a meal. And a lot of this habitat that I see bumblebees searching for right now in the fall, as they're flying around, kind of like moving around on the ground, trying to find a place to live, is I see them often in loose soil and leaves and these mossy patches. I think a lot of that is because bumblebees are these really great flyers, but they are really bad at digging. They're not very good at making a hole or moving substrate. That is their flaw. Um, so they really need this like loose substrate that is easy for them to move and manipulate so they can really get down and get to that insulated and concealed spot. So I like talking about leaf to leaves because leaves are generally a lot easier to move than really compacted soil. So right now you're probably going to see a lot of queen bumblebees flying around, crawling around on the ground, looking for a place to spend the winter. And this is kind of what it looks like when a bumblebee um, is underground and, making its overwintering place. This is a cool picture that I saw on iNaturalist of this group of common eastern bumblebees aggregating together. They all decided this was a pretty good spot to overwinter. And you can see that they've all created kind of their own little hole here. They dug out this little kind of cavity that they're going to spend the winter in. And I think it's interesting that they're aggregating, and that's something we kind of think we know about the common eastern bumblebee is they like to hibernate together. And I'm not sure why that is. And then here's a couple pictures of some common eastern bumblebees from Minnesota. These are from my colleague Elaine Evans. You can see another picture of a bumblebee under some soil, and she's dug it out. And then this is a photo in the top right of a bumblebee literally digging soil out and making a hole in a tunnel for herself to get under the ground. And you can see how loose that soil is to make it so much easier for her to dig. And she'll dig herself. They don't really dig themselves that far into the ground. They'll dig a few inches down, but really not that much more. So then it comes the dead of winter, and these bumblebees are under the ground, and they slow their metabolism so much so that they can use that sustained fat reserves that they gained in the fall. They need that food and energy to last them all winter. It's kind of like a bear. They're very similar to bears in that way, except they're not bears at all. They're insects. But they definitely need to make sure all that fat that they save stays with them until the winter. And something that I like to note, and there's kind of a climate change piece, is that when there's that snowpack on the ground and we have a lot of snow, that snow also helps these bumblebees stay insulated from the cold temperatures. Snow is cold, but it also creates a barrier from the cold air. And so I love seeing a big snowpack when it comes to thinking about the bumblebees in the winter. And they'll wait under there in the soil until the spring when they will emerge. Around April and May, bumblebees have different emergences based on the species. And they'll come out and forage, and they're going to be so hungry, and they're going to be looking for these spring ephemerals, like bluebells is one of the first things that I see two-spotted bumblebees foraging on in the spring. And that queen who mated last year in the fall spent all that time in winter and is now going to go and create a nest and start the cycle again, where she'll breed and make workers, and then queens, and then the cycle starts again. So that's kind of a quick overview of how bumblebees survive winter. But there's all these 475 other bees plus that are solitary bees. And these are bees that don't have queens. These are bees that are small. These are bees that are not as strong of flyers. And they have different strategies for surviving winter than bumblebees do. Some solitary bees do overwinter as adults, very similar to the bumblebees, but some remain in their egg chambers as pupa and prepupa, in kind of like a juvenile state. So it's like these babies in the chamber waiting to emerge for the next season. And they use a strategy called diapause to do this, which is basically allowing these insects to stay in a juvenile state, stay in their baby form in the nest, until that perfect moment to emerge when the spring starts or when the flower you really want to forage on starts blooming. And that's kind of what separates these bees from the bumblebees in terms of how they're surviving winter. So Karin talked a little bit about some mason bees, but this is a general overview of just kind of how a solitary bee nest looks. Solitary bees don't have a colony; they just create their own nest. That's all them and their offspring. So this is an example of a mining bee nest where they will dig down and then each egg and baby gets their own little chamber. And a lot of mining bees will spend their time as pre-pupa in the nest. They won't form fully into adults until that exact moment when they want to emerge in the spring or summer. And they use that diapause to be able to extend their life farther. I think it's easier to be in a pre-pupa form. It's safer. You're not using as much energy because pupating requires a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to become an adult. So you want to save that energy until right before spring to emerge. So that's kind of the idea with this diapause thing. And you can see some egg cells as well in the stem that you chopped in your garden, or maybe a deer came and chomped a stem at some time in the spring where those mason bees will lay their eggs. And so that's thinking about it broadly, but I want to share some cool examples of some solitary bees and kind of a little bit about their life cycle with the perspective of winter. And one of the first ones I want to talk about is Calides inequalis. This is the unequal cellophane bee. And this is a bee that is among the first bees and even among the first insects to emerge in the spring. They are out like late April, early May, before there's even flowers blooming sometimes, which I think is crazy. And they emerge in these really big aggregations in May where they mate, they make their nests, and they eat, and they start their life cycle again really fast. These insects overwinter as adults, so they spend that whole winter as an adult under the leaf litter, maybe just a little bit in the soil, waiting for the spring to come. And then they do everything they need to do in the May, and they'll lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch. Those adults will come out, and they will find a place to overwinter in June, and they will stay in an overwintering state from June until the following May. And I think that's crazy to spend 11 months of your life as a little insect overwintering, even in the summer. So that's just to say that a lot of insects, they start their overwintering process even before winter starts. And so that's why it's important to really have this habitat all throughout the season. Another species of bee I wanted to share is this species called Calides andrewsii. This is a species that is a specialist on this plant called alum root that I have on the screen. And this is a pretty special species. It's a prairie specialist. And it only forages on this plant, alum root. And so it likes to stay near this plant. It likes to build its nest near these plants, and it likes to overwinter near these nests or these plants. And so the strategy for this insect is they overwinter as a pupa in the nest using that strategy that I was talking about called diapause. And they have an interesting approach that I like to call the not all your eggs in one basket approach, where they can like kind of stagger their emergence in a nest so that, let's say, one year you emerge and alum root is not blooming and you bloomed or you came out of your nest too fast and it's a drought year and it's horrible and you don't get to make a nest and you don't get to eat that much food. But because these insects are able to stagger their emergence by 1, 2, or even 3 years sometimes, it kind of allows them to have offspring that is emerging throughout those years to try and get the best year possible. Because when you emerge from overwintering as an adult, you want the best chance of getting the most food and blooming when your favorite plant is, or emerging when your favorite plant is blooming. And I think that's a really interesting approach for these specialists, and how just goes to show how reliant they are on these and how specialized they are with their overwintering to emerge at the time of these plants blooming. And so I feel like I probably am getting close to time, and I could talk about so many other ways that insects overwinter. I didn't even get to talk about pollinating beetles, But I want to talk a little bit about migration because I have some really interesting insects um, that migrate. And to migrate is to move from one climate or region to another to feed or to breed, to overwinter. And this is really, really well known in invertebrate species. Like we know that songbirds migrate south in the winter because it's cold. But this does happen in insects, and it's much, much less well known. And as I was talking about a little earlier, one of the most well-studied phenomenon of insect migration is the monarch migration. I feel like I learned about this migration event when I was like 6 years old. And so it's a very common and culturally known insect migration event. And we know that those insects, they fly up from Mexico in their overwinter grounds all the way to Minnesota. They have a couple moments of offspring and then fly back to Mexico and spend the winter. It's phenomenal. It's really cool. But I want to give the spotlight to a couple other of insects that also migrate. One being the red admiral. This is another butterfly species that migrates very, very, very similarly to the monarch butterfly. This species likes to lay its eggs on plants like nettle, and so the caterpillars eat the nettle. And they'll migrate down to Texas, not all the way to Mexico, but down to Texas in those southern states, and then fly back in the spring. So another butterfly that's migrating. But my last insect that I'm going to talk about in this talk is this kind of oddball, which you've probably seen in the fall, is the hoverflies and the flower flies. And I love these insects because they are really, really underrated pollinators. And as you can see in this picture, the yellow pollen on this little flies, little tiny short hairs. They have such different hairs than bees, and it's really cute. But these insects are freaking weird. And I'm learning, as I was putting this talk together, I was learning about what other insects are migrating that aren't butterflies. And what I was learning about is that we're starting to, this is like groundbreaking science right now, is we're starting to learn that hoverflies and flower flies are migrating. And so I'm thinking about this and I'm like, flies migrating? Like, get real. But I was reading this paper from these researchers in California where they actually documented this large migration event of flower flies. I'm going to play this video for you to show you what they found. And I know watching this video, when I first was like, okay, there's just bugs flying around in this video. But when I was watching it, I noticed these flies are flying south into a headwind in large numbers. And if you ride a bike like I do, you know that riding into a headwind is horrible and it's really hard. And I think it's really fascinating that these insects are flying into this headwind in such huge numbers. It's clear that they are moving somewhere else, possibly for a seasonal change. Beautiful look at the California coast as well. So I think that's a really fascinating video. And I love from this paper these blurry photos of these flies flying in this video. I think these are pretty funny photos that they're using for identification. And I'm quoting directly from this paper. In that 35-second video, they detected 660 hoverflies flying south against a headwind and migrating to somewhere else. So over that 30-minute period where they were there, they estimate that they saw about 34,000 hoverflies flying at one time in this small little area. And so one of my biggest takeaways from doing this presentation and preparing this presentation is that there's a lot we don't know about how insects overwinter, but there's a lot that we are learning. And I feel like I'm coming away from this thinking about flower flies and how they're such cool pollinators. And I wonder what they're doing in Minnesota. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening to my presentation. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Sami. That was fascinating. I had no idea that flower flies also migrated. That's super cool. I love the video too. And it just also kind of highlights the importance of observing, like what are they doing? Why are they flying that way? Why are they flying such numbers? I love that. Thank you so much. And just a reminder, everyone, if you have questions about either presentation so far, please post them on the chat box. Angie and I are monitoring that, and we'll bring them at the end of all the presentations. And without further ado, Alexandra, please take it away. But before, Alexandra is a co-director on the Blue Thumb education team at Metro Blooms. which is a nonprofit in South Minneapolis. She works on both the Blue Thumb workshops programming, promoting the many benefits of adding native plants to home gardens, and is a co-manager of the Lawns to Legumes statewide grant program. And today she's coming here to present to us on fall gardening, supporting pollinators with native plants. Thank you, Alexandra. Now you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you so much to Sami and Karin. I'm going to apologize right now if my talk comes out a little bit like blurry because I feel like I've just had my mind blown by their talks. So I'm going to do my best to keep it together. But I'm hoping just to add a little bit to some of the stuff that they've already shared by speaking directly to the native plants that we all can be adding to, especially our home gardens, to support pollinators in the fall. A quick look at the agenda here for anyone here who isn't already convinced about using native plants. I'm of course going to give a little plug about why they're so important and why we're talking about native Minnesotan plants in particular. I'll kind of go over again why fall blooms are so important, and then the best part of this presentation is of course highlighting some specific fall blooming species that we can be using more to support our native pollinators. And then I know Karin already did a really great job of covering some fall gardening tips, so I'll probably just zoom through that really quickly to make sure we have enough time for questions here at the end. So why native plants? In the work that I do, I am regularly talking about the benefits of native plants in particular, especially for water quality. But when we think about native plants and pollinators, the reason native plants are so important is because they've developed over thousands of years with our local pollinators and building really complex relationships that are closely tied to the life cycles of pollinators. So native plant flower shapes, the color that they are, the times that they bloom, the type of pollen and nectar that they have, those all correspond to specific pollinators, to specific times in their life cycles, and that's all because they've evolved together for millennia. So this is one of the reasons why when people add native plants to their gardens, they suddenly see a huge influx of bees, butterflies, wasps, birds, all kinds of critters, because it's in their DNA to search out these specific plants, whether they're a specialist species or not. Similarly, it's why when you add cultivated species of native plants or nativars that have had maybe their flower color changed or they are double petaled, they have more petals than they usually would, they won't support the same number of creatures. And this isn't to say that non-native or introduced plants are wholly bad. They just don't provide the same high quality nectar, pollen, and habitat. So because of that, the most promising way we can continue to support our pollinators and restore our home ecosystems is by planting specifically native plants to our areas. So if you want your home gardens in particular, or maybe you're working with a school or something, you want that to support this diversity of life, we talk about creating a pollinator planting, which is really just a native plant garden that is designed and cared for with the intention of also supporting pollinators and other native wildlife. When we talk about creating a pollinator planting, the four primary things we want to consider for pollinators is number one, that you have several blooming species across the entire growing season to provide adequate forage across the entire life cycle of the pollinators. I know we've touched on that a little bit already. I'm going to hit it again in the next slide, so we'll keep going to number two, that you have some host plants for larvae. Some pollinators only lay eggs or overwinter on specific plants or eat from specific plants, as Sami was talking about. And one of the most famous ones that almost everyone knows about, of course, is monarchs and milkweed. But there are many other closely developed relationships like this. And without host plants, entire species of pollinators wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be able to create new generations in following years. So supporting those relationships by planting host plants is really critical. Number three, access to nesting sites. As both Sami, Aaron, and Karin already talked about, there are many pollinator species that don't migrate. They need to stay here to overwinter. And so sometimes that means changing your gardening practices a little bit to have some bare soil that's really accessible for those creatures. Sometimes it means leaving brush or hollow stalks available, leaving the leaves. And all of this is important for making your planting basically as inviting as possible for pollinators to call home all year round. And then finally, of course, is that your garden should have low chemical input. This is essential for the health of our pollinators, for our soils and the complex ecosystems that soils are, for our waterways, and ultimately for us as people as well. This can mean changing your gardening habits to steer clear of herbicides for weeds, but it also means planting intentionally with native plants that don't require fertilizers because they're adapted to our local soils. They're planted densely enough to shade out weeds, and then, of course, learning to live with some of the other creatures that are going to start calling your garden home. But I want to go back really quickly to just hit this point on the head one more time, why those fall blooms are so important. We think of spring and summer as the highlights of the garden season for flowers, but pollinators are already beginning to appear in early spring, and they are preparing for the overwintering season well beyond the end of the summer. Some of our large and fuzzy bumblebees, including the rusty patch bumblebee, can forage well into October before finally nesting for the winter. And then those pollinators that are migrating need access to nectar and pollen throughout their migration path to fuel their long journeys. So we need to have blooming flowers all through September into October. Sometimes with these warm years, it might even be a little bit into November to support these creatures. And honestly, like, why wouldn't you want to add more flowers to create the fall, make the fall season even more beautiful? The leaves are gorgeous, but like, how gorgeous is it to add some of these plants that you're seeing here too? They're great. So I want to go ahead and just highlight some of these later blooming species that are known to support pollinators well into the fall. We'll start off with the really obvious choice, and it's honestly one of my favorites, asters. There are over 20 native aster species in Minnesota, and there are multiple options of species for almost every site condition. So with sunny and dry sites, silky or aromatic aster is a great choice. Sunny and mesic, or sort of soils that are like medium wet, New England and smooth aster do really well. And if you have a shady site condition, calico aster or big leafed aster, large leafed aster are going to be great choices as well. Asters can start blooming in late August and bloom all the way through into November occasionally, providing some of the latest forage for our pollinators. As a personal anecdote, the New England aster in my garden only like just started taking off, so it's going to be there in this beautiful purple hue for a little while to come yet, which I am so excited about. They're also kind of a fun native alternative to mums, which is a really common like fall plant that people will have, and they're super, super important for our pollinators. Asters are considered a keystone species across all three ecoregions in Minnesota and are host plants for a variety of caterpillars, including the pearl crescent butterfly, and they support a number of pollen specialist bees in Minnesota as well. Really quick little fun fact I want to share about calico aster. The centers of the flowers here in the middle, they turn from yellow to pink when the nectar is exhausted from each flower. And it's our native pollinators that know how to recognize that color change and forage efficiently on them. But it also just makes them like the cutest little flowers I've ever seen. Another powerhouse species for pollinators in the fall are, of course, goldenrods. There are 15 native goldenrod species in Minnesota. And again, Solidago, this genus that they belong to, is a keystone species or genus across all three ecoregions in Minnesota. They're hosts, again, for many caterpillar species, for food, for pollen specialist bees. And this relationship might help tip you off, again, that goldenrods are not, in fact, wind pollinated. And so they get a really bad rap, but they're not the cause of fall allergies. So plant as much goldenrod as you can to help shade out ragweed, which is really the evil in our fall gardens right now. Zigzag goldenrod on the left does really well in shady conditions and is what we like to call a robust native plant. It can cover quite a bit of ground and it can make a really great ground cover in a shady garden. Stiff goldenrod and showy goldenrod are really popular in garden designs because of their upright and kind of refined appearance. But you'll also see a lot of Canada goldenrod. And a note that I like to give about Canada goldenrod, it's probably the most common variety of goldenrod that people will see. It's known for spreading pretty aggressively. And so if you had goldenrod suddenly just appear in your yard, it's probably Canada goldenrod. It's not bad, it just might take a little bit of extra paying attention to keep it contained if you decide to keep it in your yard. Up next, we have some species that do well in some wetter soils and are particularly great options if you have a wetland or shoreline property or a rain garden. Turtlehead is a really fun plant with these super interesting little flower shapes that are enticing for larger bees and bumblebees to force their way into. And then while turtlehead is sort of a shorter, generally like 1 to 3 feet tall plant, Joe Pyeweed here on the slide too is a standout wet garden plant for the back of a garden or the center of a rain garden because it can easily get to 5, 6 over feet tall. It's really, really an impressive plant. It's also an excellent source of nectar. It starts to bloom right as some of the like big time summer showstoppers have kind of passed their peak. So once these flowers start to bloom, you will immediately see it covered in bees. And for that reason alone, it's one of my favorites. I have it planted right outside a window of my house so I can watch all those bees as they start to forage. It's amazing. Another couple of standouts, especially in wet garden sites, is the lobelia species. We've got cardinal flower here on the left, which is probably the truest red blooming native plant in Minnesota. It's also a magnet for hummingbirds who come to the flowers for their nectar. And so for that reason alone, people love to add it to their garden sites. And then in the same lobelia genus, we've got great blue lobelia, which has a similar kind of upright stalk of flowers, but these rich blue purple blooms instead. We consider both of these to be short-lived perennials that need to self-seed every year to come back and have staying power in your garden. So that's just something to note. Native gardens, they really do change over time, and it's important to, if you want to keep a flower right where it is, you might need to do a little bit of seed collection and tending to make sure it comes back. Similar, the Rudbeckia species, the black-eyed Susan, the brown-eyed Susan, these are classics in gardens already. They're great. They bloom kind of late summer into the fall. And they're also these short-lived perennials that tend to move around in your garden as they self-seed. But because of their short-lived kind of properties, they do a really great job of coming up pretty quickly and crowding out weeds as some of your slower growing natives may take a little bit more time to fully mature in your gardens. They're also host plants to several species of butterflies and moths, so they're happy little sunflowers to add. And then finally, we've got a couple of plants left here. We've got the two native gentians, bottle gentian, which is the blue on the left, and then cream gentian. These again are flowers that are really great fun to do some bumblebee spotting in because they tend to have to use their entire bodies to separate those flower petals that are so close together at the tip to reach the nectar inside. And if you haven't just like watched a little bumblebee butt wiggle into these, you haven't lived. Um, and then the last one here I have is the sneeze weed, which I think just looks like something straight out of a Dr. Seuss book with its giant center and gorgeous little like skirt of yellow petals. It has both high quality nectar and pollen, and it grows quite tall, like 4 feet or so. But as it flops over a little bit and those stems break, it supports stem nesting bees who can overwinter in those stems as well. I want to give a shout out to native trees and shrubs. We've talked about them a little bit in some of the previous presentations, but we often think of these as early season forage because they're some of the first plants to bloom in the spring, but they're also really important host sites. Like we said, so many of our pollinators will overwinter in some of that leaf litter, or they spend their entire caterpillar stage on a specific species of tree and need to stay around that tree for their entire life cycle. So consider planting some of these keystone species, these native tree species and shrub species to support as many pollinators as possible. Or if you already have an existing one, adding a soft landing planting. We have a lot of great templates to help you kind of plan out a garden just like that, including this one that's available on both the Blue Thumb website and on the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources website from Lawns to Legumes. I won't touch too long on this. Again, we've already hit leave the leaves. We've hit leave those stems for overwintering bees. But just know that like one of the worst things that you can do for pollinators is to scoop them up, put them in bags, and send them off to a compost pile. So as best you can, adapting your land care practices in the fall to support our overwintering species is going to be so important. And then if you are still thinking, I need to add some of these fall blooming species to my yard as soon as possible, like now is a great time. We still have some time left in the growing year to get out and plant native plants. Fall is such a wonderful time for planting native species because they're starting to direct all of their energy into their roots. And so it'll give them kind of a head start on coming up more developed, more mature, more robust in the spring. And you might start to see blooms even earlier. It often takes native plants a couple of growing seasons to mature and bloom, but giving them this head start is a really great time. It's also great because there's a little bit less maintenance for you. There's less weed pressure. There's fewer watering days before the hard frost. So take advantage of sales on native plants that are going on right now and add some of these to your garden before the winter comes for us all. And then if you are wondering, how do I design a garden like this? How do I find what plants are blooming in the fall? What do I do? Where do I buy them? Just know we have a ton of resources available on our Blue Thumb website to help you do exactly that. But I will go ahead and stop now, hand it back to Rebecca to manage the Q&A.
Thank you, Alexandra. This was awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate your presentation. I think we all did, and those very pointed recommendations. And I have been copy pasting all the questions that have been posted on our chat. I think so for all of you still, I see we lost a couple of participants of attendees because I understand, lunchtime is ending for a lot of people, but we wanted to allot 15 minutes after 1 p.m. for the Q&A. And again, this webinar is being recorded, and if folks want to revisit and coming back to it, you will be able to once we post it on our website, on EQB Pollinator website. So the first question that we got, and I think is more of a comment rather than a question, but if any of the presenters have any pointers for Aida Mendez, she says, my concern about leaving the leaves is the garden mice dwelling on the fallen leaves. And I think maybe some people will resonate with that maybe there are some quote unquote unwanted critters that may be also using that as protection. Any thoughts on that from the presenters?
I'm happy to take that one on. So number one, fully understand your concern. Oftentimes what we talk with people about is, choosing an area of your yard where you're going to be a little bit more comfortable with having maybe mice come. So in my yard in particular, we get quite a few leaves on our front yard, and I don't rake them into the beds that are the foundation plantings right next to our house. We typically will move them to a further side yard so that it's not so bothersome. I also have 3 dogs, so it's not the biggest concern. But one thing I do really like to emphasize also when we're talking about these kind of practices that bring in maybe native plants that kind of change the way that we're managing our landscapes. We're supporting pollinators, we're supporting all of these different kinds of wildlife. And so learning how to expect that they'll come and learn to kind of coexist with them can be really important because we can't have one part of the ecosystem without the other. So that's why I say like learning to move it into different places that are maybe further away from your home and things like that can be a great practice so that you're not having to deal with them closer to where you are.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was a great answer. Thank you so much. Let's move on, just for the sake of time, to the next question. Kavanaugh Soul says, concerning Leave the Leaves, we collect tons and tons of leaves in the fall to use in our seedling starts in the spring. Is there a better time to harvest fallen leaves? Example, early versus late fall, or some other factor to consider to reduce impact? Again, open to any of the presenters.
I don't know the answer exactly. I think there's probably some insects that are coming down with the early season leaves and maybe then finding their way into the soil, and some that are coming down with later leaves and then finding their way into the soil or staying on the leaf. So there's probably like just a diversity of things happening throughout the season. So kind of doing a little bit of a lot of things, or one of the things I sort of worry about in some of these recommendations is that we treat our habitats as almost like so precious that we can't interact with it because we might do damage to it. And that is a worry that I have that makes us feel like we shouldn't be here because we are always going to do harm. And I just want to push on that in case there's any sentiment there that like just do a little bit of, early season removal or early season capture, and then on another spot do a little late season. And just so like, yeah, I don't know if it's just a general idea,
Yeah.
not a very scientific one.
I like that, like in the sense of like just kind of, I don't think you should not harvest leaves for an activity like this that, you enjoy and makes you feel connected to the land. And I would say it's kind of like in a foraging sense, when I go foraging, I'm picking until it feels like I'm picking too much. And you can maybe have a similar approach to these leaves. It's like, you have something to do, but like, you'll feel it when you feel like maybe you're making an impact that is too much. And yeah, I'll just echo that like different insects are getting into the ground and into the leaves in such different times of years. Like if you remember the cellophane bee is overwintering in June, like, and there's sometimes we just can't, account for everybody. But, if you just go in moderation, maybe that's the best approach.
Thank you, Sami and Karin. Yeah, things are complicated when you're talking about a diversity of animals, not just one single species, but so many different animals are using these resources too. So I appreciate that you're bringing that nuance to the table too. Thank you. Let's see. Sandra Knudsen asks, if my wild bee balm leaves have a white powdery substance on them, would it be best to cut those back in the fall rather than leave it over winter?
So Monarda is very susceptible to powdery mildew. It happens on many, many, many plants of Monarda. I almost never see it without it at this point in the year. And I would say it is oftentimes more of an aesthetic concern. At this point, you can leave it, and cutting it back is not necessarily going to make it so that it doesn't appear next year, I guess is what I'm getting at. So if you want to leave it, it will come back next year and it will be just as robust as Monarda always is. If you want to cut it back, that's an option, but it's not going to kill your plant.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for that. Okay, so Ina Mendes asks again another question. How do we protect the native plants for bunnies? Anybody has an idea?
We talk about this, sorry to keep taking so many of these, but we talk about this a lot with Lawns to Legumes grantees as well. And really, the best protection from bunnies is physical protection. So typically, the hope is that they're going after some of those younger plants, right, when they're first planted, when they're still tender. And we think of that as the first full growing season. So it might be the first entire year that you're thinking of those plants as just little babies and putting up like fencing, putting like if you have a small number of plants, putting like little wire cloches over them. You can get them for like $1, these little wire baskets at the Dollar Tree. Those can be really great. And knowing that you shouldn't have to do that forever. Once the plant is robust enough, they're typically less palatable to rabbits. And they will start to spread such that there might be enough for both the bunnies to have a little snack and for you to still have flowers as well. But that first full growing season, physical protection is the way to go.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think we have time for a couple more questions. We have Alison Phillips asks, should we put down loose soil or lightly rake the soil now to help the ground-dwelling hibernating bees? So I think that comes from Sami's talk about bumblebee queens, digging out loose
Mhm.
soil, things like that. So is there a way to maybe help?
Yeah, I think you are definitely welcome to like, rake some soil in your garden or like maybe, bring it up a little bit. I think the best way to kind of approach like, if you want to make your garden attractive to overwintering and ground dwelling bees, having a diversity of different kinds of substrates and compactness and looseness and leaves, is really attractive to letting them choose what like feels good for them. I feel like in the spring I find this mining bee aggregation near my apartment that is like this very compacted lawn, but these Andrina, the mining bees, they love it, and it's just this huge colony of bees. Whereas like what I was saying in my presentation about the bumblebees, they can't dig like that. So I feel like my suggestion would to be, try and have a lot of different kinds of substrates, in your yard or your garden. And you can like experiment around and see what's working for you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sami. Diversity. It's always the answer. Um, let's see. Let me see another question that we can bring to the attention of the presenters. How can someone raise the concerns of the Jennifer Furan asks, how can someone raise the concerns of the overpopulation of herbivores, rabbits particularly, with too few natural predators that decimate native plant populations, including early spring ephemerals and fall natives? It seems there needs to be a larger initiative to address this.
I think the way you're speaking about this right now is how you raise concern about this issue, especially in urban areas. There are so many rabbits that are eating our plants, and yeah, not a lot of predators. And I feel like it is something that could be talked about more. I feel like the amount of rabbits in my neighborhood is very normalized, and people don't talk about it from that perspective unless you are a gardener and you are noticing your plants being eaten. Um, I think it is a large initiative to address because that would mean creating habitat for predators who need large spans of habitat. So it's a big change that needs to happen at like a system level. And I think talking about it like this and bringing it up is a great way to start and get these conversations going.
Thank you so much, all of our presenters. We're at time. However, there's one question that I also have. I'm going to highlight it just real quick. So it's about mulching leaves with a mower. Because some people suggest that that's a good practice, maybe to cut it down in smaller pieces so that it doesn't suffocate, for example, turf grass. It says, is that just killing friends who are already there, or leaf pieces beneficial to anyone? So mulching to small pieces versus leaving the whole leaves and moving them. Any recommendation on that?
I I bet Alexandra has a more polished answer to this. However, I would say try to save some unmulched. If your lawn is not going anywhere because you need it for some recreation purpose or whatever, I think mulching your leaves has consequences, but extracting it all and putting it in a landfill is worse because the bits of leaf material has microbes on it and is food for fungi, and that fungi is food for invertebrates. So you may have killed an invertebrate that was living on that leaf at the time that it was mulched, but it is leaving it on site creates nutrients and microbial activity that can occur that wouldn't occur if the whole thing was extracted and pulled off site. So I would use it as a resort only after you've preserved some full leaves in a protected spot.
Thank you, Karin. I think that's a great answer. I don't know, Alexandra, do you want to add anything to that answer?
No, I want to say 100%, Karen. That was great. That's exactly what I would recommend too. Having some mulch leaves, pulling some off, mulching some leaves on your lawn can also be really beneficial, like in restoring some nutrients to your lawn too. So both practices can be great, but for invertebrates, pulling some aside is fabulous, and then not sending any away is the best thing of all.
Thank you. And again, thank you. Thank you so much to our presenters. Your talks were so interesting, and definitely I learned many new things. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Angie, for helping with logistics. And thank you, everyone who's still online right here with us for staying till the end. Again, I'm just going to repeat that we will have this presentation, this whole webinar posted on our website. We'll send a note to all people who registered when it's ready for you to have it access to it on our website. So again, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your fall, and I hope you're all encouraged to take action to help pollinators in this season. Thank you.